The first time I saw our bank account drop like that, I thought it had to be a mistake, because nobody wakes up thinking the life they built together can quietly disappear in numbers on a screen. But that morning at 6:13 a.m. in our suburban home outside Denver, I was standing in the kitchen with a cup of black coffee going cold in my hand, watching my phone refresh the balance again and again like it might change its mind. And it didn't. It just kept showing the same impossible truth. $38,000 gone. Not frozen, not pending, just gone. And I remember thinking that silence has a sound when you realize something is wrong, a kind of pressure in your ears that makes even your own breathing feel distant. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 41 years old. I work in logistics management for a regional distribution company. Nothing glamorous, nothing dramatic, just a steady job that pays the mortgage and keeps life predictable, or at least that's what I believed until that morning. Because from the outside, my life with Olivia Walker looked exactly like the kind of marriage people call stable. We had a 4-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood where kids rode bikes in the summer and neighbors waved even when they didn't know your name. Olivia worked in corporate consulting, always busy, always traveling a few days here and there. And I never questioned it, because trust is supposed to be the foundation you don't inspect every day. It's supposed to hold without inspection, and for 8 years I believed it did. But that morning something didn't feel like a foundation anymore. It felt like a floor that had already been hollowed out underneath me. I checked the transaction history again, scrolling slowly, my thumb pausing on each line like maybe I had misread it. Multiple transfers, small at first, then larger, all moving in a pattern I didn't recognize, all routed through accounts I had never seen before. And that's when I saw the name Daniel Cooper appear for the first time, not loudly, not obviously, just a single reference buried between 2 payments like a shadow hiding in plain sight. I didn't react the way I thought I would. There was no anger, no explosion, just a strange stillness, like my body had stepped back before my mind could catch up. I sat down at the kitchen table where Olivia and I used to eat dinner together when we still had time for things like that, and I tried to build a logical explanation, maybe an accounting error, maybe a system glitch, maybe something administrative I didn't understand, because the alternative meant something else entirely, and my brain wasn't ready to accept that yet. Upstairs I could hear the shower running, Olivia getting ready like any normal morning, humming faintly through the walls like nothing in the world had changed. And that contrast is what I remember most. The sound of ordinary life happening at the exact same time my financial reality was collapsing. I looked at our joint savings account again, then the checking account, then the credit line we had opened last year for home improvements that never really happened. All of it telling the same story, a slow, deliberate extraction of money over months, carefully timed, carefully hidden. And when I finally leaned back in my chair, I noticed my hands weren't shaking. Not yet. They were just still, like they belonged to someone watching a situation instead of living inside it. I didn't confront her that morning. I didn't even move when she came downstairs 20 minutes later wearing a light gray blazer, her hair still slightly damp, asking me if I had slept well, and I remember nodding because my mouth couldn't find the right shape for the question burning inside me. Where is our money? But instead I just watched her pour coffee into her travel mug and check her phone like any other day. And for the first time in 8 years of marriage, I realized I didn't actually know what she was looking at when she looked down at that screen. I only knew what I had assumed. An assumption is a quiet thing until it isn't, until it starts to sound like everything breaking at once. And as she walked out the door and said she had meetings all day downtown, I stood there in the hallway holding a bank notification that refused to change, and I understood something I wasn't ready to say out loud yet, that whatever Olivia was building behind my back, it had already been running longer than I had been aware of it, and I was no longer looking at a mistake. I was looking at a pattern, and patterns don't happen by accident. They happen because someone designs them that way. And somewhere in that realization, something inside me stopped trying to explain it away and started trying to remember everything I had overlooked. By the time Olivia's car pulled out of the driveway, I was still sitting at the kitchen table with my phone face up and the bank notifications frozen on the screen like they were waiting for me to accept them as reality. But acceptance is not something that comes easily when your entire understanding of your own life starts to fracture in silence. So I did what most people do when they are not ready to confront the truth. I started looking for anything that could make it feel less real. I opened the bank app again, then the desktop login on my laptop, Then the archived email notifications from our financial institution, and each time the same pattern returned with more clarity, not a single accidental charge, not a single isolated transfer, but a structured flow of money moving in carefully spaced intervals over the last 4 months. Always on weekdays when I was at work. Always in amounts just small enough to avoid immediate alerts, but large enough to accumulate into something undeniable. And somewhere in that pattern was the name Daniel Cooper, repeating like a signal I had somehow missed for too long. I leaned back and stared at the kitchen window where morning light was now fully spread across the yard. And I tried to place Daniel Cooper in any context that made sense. Co-workers, clients, conferences Olivia had mentioned in passing. But the problem with trying to reconstruct a hidden structure is that every innocent memory starts to feel like it might have been edited. I remembered Olivia's increased travel schedule over the past half year, the way she had started guarding her phone more carefully, the way conversations about finances had become strangely minimal, almost rehearsed, and I had accepted all of it because trust makes you generous with explanations that should probably be questioned. I got up and walked through the house slowly, noticing details I had ignored for months. A new laptop charger in her office that did not match her company equipment, printed documents in the recycling bin with headers I did not recognize, and a small stack of receipts on the counter that were not categorized the way we usually organized household expenses. Each detail on its own felt harmless, but together they formed a kind of quiet accumulation that I could no longer unsee. I called the bank next, keeping my voice steady in a way that felt almost artificial, and asked them to walk me through recent activity on our joint accounts. The representative spoke in calm professional sentences, confirming transfers, dates, and destination accounts that matched what I had already seen. And when I asked about the receiving account associated with Daniel Cooper, she paused briefly before saying it was linked to a business account registered under a consulting entity. Nothing illegal on record, nothing flagged, just transactions authorized through valid credentials, which meant someone with access had been deliberately moving money in a way that looked legitimate on paper. I thanked her and ended the call, then sat in silence long enough to notice how loud the house felt without conversation in it. The refrigerator hum, the distant ticking of the hallway clock, even the air conditioner cycling on and off as if nothing unusual was happening at all. But inside my mind, the structure of the last 6 months was rearranging itself, and I began to see moments differently. Olivia's late-night calls taken in another room, her explanation of client dinners that always ended with vague descriptions instead of names, the gradual shift in how she discussed our finances, not as something shared, but something already understood and therefore not needing discussion. I opened our shared calendar and found entries that matched her travel days, all consistent with her consulting work. But now I noticed gaps, overlaps, and patterns of repetition that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. By noon, I had created a timeline on a blank document, listing every known transfer, every reported trip, every financial interaction that involved both of us. And as the structure grew clearer, so did the realization that I was not dealing with a single impulsive act, but a sustained system that had operated quietly alongside our marriage. Olivia returned home just after 5 in the evening, as if nothing had changed, placing her keys on the counter and asking me about my day with the same tone she always used, and I responded carefully, measuring my words, in a way that felt unfamiliar. Because once you start seeing patterns, you cannot unsee them, and the hardest part is learning how to speak normally while your understanding of everything you thought was stable has already shifted into something else entirely. I watched her move through the kitchen, preparing dinner, checking messages, existing in the ordinary rhythm of our shared space, and I realized that whatever truth I was approaching, it had likely been living in that same space for a long time without ever announcing itself. That night, I could not bring myself to act normal, even though nothing on the surface had changed, because once you have seen a pattern behind something you trusted, normal becomes the hardest performance of all. So I moved through the evening like a man trying to remember how to inhabit his own life. Sitting at the dinner table while Olivia talked about her day in a way that sounded rehearsed but still natural enough that anyone else would never question it. She mentioned client meetings in downtown Chicago. She mentioned follow-up calls. She mentioned a possible new contract that would require more travel next month, and I listened to every word while simultaneously measuring it against what I now knew, and the distance between those two versions of reality made it difficult to even respond at the right moments. I nodded when I was supposed to nod. I asked small questions when silence became too noticeable, and I studied her face in the same way I had studied the bank records. Earlier, looking for inconsistencies that might confirm or deny what I was beginning to believe, but Olivia was always composed, always controlled, the kind of calm that does not crack under observation. And that made everything more difficult because certainty usually comes from visible mistakes. But there were none, only structure, only repetition, only carefully maintained normality. After dinner, she went upstairs early saying she needed to prepare for an early meeting, and I stayed downstairs long after the lights in the house softened into nighttime quiet. I opened my laptop again and expanded the timeline I had started earlier, this time adding everything I could remember about Daniel Cooper, not just the transactions but any mention of him in Olivia's past conversations, and I realized something unsettling. I did not actually know what he did. I had assumed he was part of her professional circle, but I had never seen his name attached to any official document we had ever reviewed together, which meant his presence in our financial system was either extremely limited or deliberately hidden. I searched his name through public records and professional directories, and what I found was minimal: a registered consulting professional with a small firm that appeared to operate as an intermediary for larger corporate accounts. Nothing suspicious on the surface, but also nothing that justified the scale of financial movement I had already seen, and that contradiction settled heavily in my mind, like a missing piece that did not belong anywhere logical. Over the next 2 days, I began to observe without interfering, coming home from work, and noting small deviations in routine. Olivia's phone always face down now, her laptop always closed before I could see the screen, her conversations becoming slightly shorter when I entered the room, not abrupt, just adjusted, like someone maintaining balance on a surface that required constant correction. And the more I observed, the more I noticed that the transfers were not random at all. They followed Olivia's travel schedule almost perfectly, appearing within hours of her being in specific cities and always in amounts that matched round financial thresholds: $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, never uneven, never emotionally driven, always structured. And that structure began to feel like the most important detail of all, because emotion creates chaos and chaos leaves traces, but structure leaves systems, and systems leave patterns that can be followed backward. On the third night, I stopped trying to interpret and started trying to verify. I contacted a forensic accounting friend from my previous job, someone I trusted but had not spoken to in over a year, and I asked him a simple question about how often joint accounts get routed through secondary consulting entities without triggering internal alerts. He paused for a moment before telling me that it was rare, but not impossible, if someone had legitimate access credentials and a reason that appeared operational rather than personal. He said the key was authorization, not secrecy, and that sentence stayed with me long after the call ended, because it meant that whoever was moving the money was not breaking in. They were already inside the system. That night, I could not sleep, and I found myself sitting in the dark kitchen again, replaying everything I knew about Olivia's work life, her clients, her travel, her carefully constructed explanations, and I realized something I had not allowed myself to think before: that every piece of normality I had been observing might not have been hiding a single mistake, but instead supporting a larger structure that I had simply never been invited to see. And as that thought settled in, I felt the ground beneath my understanding shift. Again, not suddenly, but steadily, like something underneath me had begun to move long before I noticed it was already gone. The morning after I stopped sleeping properly felt like the world had been slightly misaligned overnight, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that I could feel it in every small routine. The way the coffee tasted a little too bitter, the way the house sounded a little too quiet even when nothing was missing. And Olivia acted exactly the same as she always did, which somehow made everything harder to interpret, because consistency can either mean innocence or mastery of concealment. And at that point, I no longer trusted my ability to tell the difference. She left early that day wearing a dark navy blazer and carrying the same structured confidence she always used for work, kissing me on the cheek briefly as she walked past, as if we were still operating inside a version of life that had not been questioned yet. And I stood at the kitchen counter watching the garage door close behind her car, trying to decide whether I was following paranoia or simply following evidence that refused to explain itself. I called in late to work for the first time in months and sat down with my laptop again, this time focusing not on the money that had moved, but on the pathway it had taken, because money does not disappear, it only changes location, and every location leaves a trace somewhere in a system designed to record everything. I went deeper into our joint banking structure, examining linked accounts, authorized devices, and login patterns, and what I found changed the shape of the problem again, because there was a secondary device consistently authorized. During Olivia's travel periods, a device that was not mine and not registered under any household profile I recognized, and that meant access was not incidental, it was persistent. I spent the next hour cross-referencing timestamps from transfers with Olivia's reported meeting schedule, and the alignment was too precise to be accidental. Every transfer followed within a narrow window after her arrival in a specific city, usually within 2 to 4 hours, and always during periods when I was at work or asleep, which meant the system was not only hidden, it was synchronized with our daily separation, as if someone had studied when I would not be looking. I felt a strange clarity building as I documented everything into a single file, no longer trying to interpret intention, only recording structure, because structure is harder to argue with than emotion. Around noon, I received a notification that Olivia had left her tablet at home, something she almost never did, and for a moment I simply stared at it sitting on the living room couch like an unlocked door that had been left open unintentionally. I knew I should not access it. I knew that boundary existed for a reason, but boundaries had already stopped meaning the same thing after the bank records. So I picked it up and found it already logged into a cloud account that synced with her phone. What I saw there was not dramatic in isolation, no single message that confirmed anything outright, but fragments of communication that filled in the gaps between transactions. Calendar notes referencing meetings with Daniel Cooper labeled as financial review sessions. Shared documents that tracked account performance under consulting. Categories, and one recurring file titled only with a code that matched the routing reference on multiple transfers I had already identified. I sat back slowly as the pieces began to align into something far more organized than betrayal in the emotional sense. This was coordination, repeated execution of steps designed to move money under the appearance of legitimacy. And as I continued to read, I noticed something else that tightened the situation further, because Olivia was not acting alone. In every step, Daniel Cooper's name appeared not just as a recipient, but occasionally as an authorized approver on certain transactions, which meant access had been extended beyond our household structure through a legal or contractual channel I had never been made aware of. And that realization introduced a new layer I had not considered before, because this was no longer just about secrecy inside a marriage. It was about overlap between personal trust and financial authority. I closed the tablet and sat in silence for a long time, not because I was confused, but because I was finally starting to see the full shape of what had been built without my knowledge, and it was larger than I had expected, more deliberate than I had prepared for. And when Olivia returned home that evening and asked me casually if I had seen her tablet, I simply said yes and handed it back to her without expression, watching carefully for any reaction that might reveal surprise, concern, or disruption in her composure. But there was none, only a brief nod and a calm thank you before she placed it back in her bag and continued with her evening routine as if nothing had shifted between us. And that was when I understood that whatever truth I was moving toward, it had already been accounted for on her side of the equation long before I ever started asking questions. By the time I handed the tablet back to Olivia and watched her slip it into her bag without hesitation, something had already changed inside me that I could not easily reverse, not because of what I had seen in a single moment, but because of the accumulation of consistency across every layer of her life that no longer felt like coincidence. And the next morning I woke up earlier than usual, not from rest, but from the absence of it, as if my mind had decided sleep was no longer productive. I sat in the dark kitchen again with a legal pad this time instead of a laptop, because something about writing things by hand forces clarity that screens tend to soften, and I began reconstructing everything in a linear timeline starting 4 months back, when the first unexplained transfer had appeared. I marked each date, each amount, each corresponding travel record from Olivia's calendar. And by the time I reached the third page, I no longer needed confirmation because the structure was self-evident. There was a system of movement, a rhythm between her physical presence in different cities and the flow of money leaving our accounts. And the consistency of that rhythm suggested planning rather than impulse. I paused only once when I noticed my own handwriting tightening as the list grew longer, as if my body was reacting before my mind fully processed it. Around mid-morning, I received a message from Olivia, saying she would be late returning home due to extended client review sessions, and I stared at the words for a long time because I had seen similar phrases too many times now to accept them at face value. Instead of responding, I opened a different set of records, the ones related to account permissions and authorized financial instruments. And that was when I found the second layer, a signed authorization form. I had never been shown that extended limited transaction approval rights to a consulting intermediary tied to Daniel Cooper's firm. The document itself was technically valid, structured in legal language that made it difficult to challenge on surface inspection, but the signature metadata indicated it had been executed during one of Olivia's business trips when I had been out of state for work, and that detail alone shifted the situation from hidden activity to procedural embedding, meaning the system was not bypassing oversight. It was operating within an expanded definition of authorization that I had never agreed to. I leaned back in my chair and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not panic, not anger, but recognition that the architecture of trust in our financial life had been quietly redefined without my participation. I spent the next hour contacting our bank again, this time requesting a full audit trail of account modifications over the last 6 months. And while the representative could not provide immediate access, she confirmed that multiple permission changes had been logged under valid credentials tied to both joint account holders, which meant someone had entered the system with legitimate access and altered its internal boundaries in ways that still appeared compliant. After I ended the call, I walked through the house again, but this time I was no longer searching for signs of emotional betrayal. I was mapping infrastructure. I noticed which drawers had been reorganized, which files had been moved, even the subtle shift in how mail was being sorted on the counter. Everything began to feel like it belonged to a version of our life that had been quietly optimized for something I was not included in. When Olivia returned home that evening, she seemed slightly more tired than usual, but still composed. She placed her keys down, asked about dinner, and began preparing a salad while speaking casually about her day as if nothing had changed. I observed her closely now, not for emotional tells, but for structural consistency. And I realized she never once contradicted any of the timelines I had reconstructed. She never once offered details that would break the pattern, and that absence of friction itself became its own form of confirmation. Later that night, after she went to bed, I reviewed everything again, and this time I did not try to find a mistake in the data. I tried to understand the logic of the system that had been built around me, and I reached a conclusion I could no longer avoid, that whatever had been happening was not random or emotional in execution. It was procedural, deliberate, and maintained over time with enough precision that it could only exist if multiple parts had been aligned with intent. And as I closed the notebook and sat in the quiet of the house, I understood that I was no longer reacting to suspicion. I was now standing inside a structure that had already been completed without me. The moment I stopped trying to emotionally interpret what was happening and instead treated everything as a system to be mapped, something inside the situation became clearer, not easier, but sharper, as if I had finally switched from standing inside the problem to observing its structure from above. And over the next 2 days, I stopped reacting entirely and started collecting. Every action in my routine became deliberate. Every login, every notification, every casual conversation with Olivia turned into data points that I quietly recorded afterward, not because I wanted to accuse her without certainty, but because certainty was the only thing I could no longer afford to be wrong about. Olivia continued her life exactly as before, waking up early, leaving for work, returning home with controlled exhaustion that never spilled into detail. And the consistency of her behavior became its own kind of pressure because it did not match the scale of the financial structure I had uncovered, which meant either I was missing something critical or she had become extremely skilled at maintaining parallel realities without overlap. On the third morning, I made a decision that shifted my position from observation to verification. I called in a personal favor from someone I had worked with years ago in corporate compliance auditing, a man named Michael Harris who had spent most of his career reviewing financial systems for irregular authorization patterns. I did not tell him everything, only that I needed help understanding how joint account permissions could be extended without obvious alarm triggers, and he agreed to look at what I had. I sent him a carefully curated summary of the transaction logs, the authorization timestamps, and the account linkage structure, and then I waited without following up because I had learned that urgency often clouds interpretation. That evening, Olivia came home later than usual and mentioned traffic on the interstate and a delayed client meeting downtown. I nodded and asked nothing further, not because I believed her explanation, but because I had stopped treating explanations as meaningful data unless they could be verified independently. After dinner, she went upstairs early again, and I remained in the living room with the lights dimmed, reviewing everything I had already compiled. And for the first time, I noticed something I had previously overlooked. The transfers were not only aligned with Olivia's travel schedule, they were also aligned with weekdays where I had predictable work commitments that kept me physically distant from home, which meant whoever structured this system had studied not just access, but absence. And that realization carried a different weight because it implied awareness of my routine at a level that required continuous observation over time. The following afternoon, Michael called me back, his voice more measured than I expected, and he confirmed that the structure I had described was unusual, but technically possible under a layered authorization model where a primary account holder grants limited operational rights to a secondary consulting entity under predefined financial review clauses. He explained that while this system is typically used for corporate efficiency, it can be repurposed in personal accounts if the documentation appears legitimate and the approval chain remains intact. I asked him directly whether such a structure could be used to move funds without raising immediate red flags, and he paused before saying yes. If all parties involved maintain consistent access credentials, and if the transactions are framed within approved consulting or advisory activity, then the system would not inherently distinguish intent, only authorization. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, not because I was confused, but because I was beginning to understand that confusion had been part of the delay, a necessary buffer that kept me from recognizing the scale of what had been built. I returned to the authorization documents again, this time focusing not on the money itself, but on the language used to justify access. And I noticed how carefully neutral every clause was, how nothing in the structure explicitly referenced personal transfer of funds. Everything was framed in terms of financial oversight, advisory review, and operational efficiency, which meant the system was never designed to reveal intent, only to validate procedure. That night, Olivia returned home with a small change in her demeanor, not noticeable in isolation, but distinct in context. She asked if I was feeling all right in a way that suggested observation rather than concern, and I responded with the same calm I had been practicing. And as we sat in the same room, sharing the same quiet space, I realized that whatever had been happening between us was no longer hidden in emotion or argument. It was embedded in systems, permissions, and structures that existed independently of how either of us chose to interpret them. And once I understood that, I also understood that the next step would no longer be about discovery, but about exposure. The days that followed carried a different kind of silence, not the peaceful kind that comes from resolution, but the tense silence that exists before a system reveals its final shape. And I found myself living inside that silence while continuing to function as if nothing had changed, waking up at the same time, driving the same route to work, answering emails with the same professional tone. But internally, I was no longer inside the same version of my life, because every ordinary action now felt like it had a second meaning underneath it. And while I was maintaining that outward stability, I was also preparing for something I could not yet define fully, only anticipate. And on the morning I received the message from Michael Harris, that anticipation became direction. His email was brief, structured, and careful, confirming that after reviewing the financial logs and authorization architecture I had sent him, he had identified multiple compliance irregularities that did not violate the system technically, but suggested deliberate manipulation of access timing and approval layering. He explained that what I was seeing was consistent with a coordinated authorization environment where multiple valid permissions are used in sequence to create movement patterns that appear routine to the system but are actually directional in outcome. I read the message twice, without reacting outwardly, then a third time more slowly. Because what mattered was not the confirmation itself, but the implication that someone had intentionally designed a pathway through legitimacy rather than around it. And that meant exposure would require more than discovery. It would require reconstruction of intent through evidence the system itself could not deny. I replied with a simple acknowledgement and closed the laptop. And for the first time since this began, I understood that I was no longer investigating privately. I was building a case whether I intended to or not. That evening, Olivia came home earlier than expected, which immediately shifted my attention because deviations in routine had become more meaningful than any direct statement she could make. She was calm as always, but there was a subtle difference in how she moved through the house, as if she was aware of timing more precisely than before. She asked about dinner, about my day, about small domestic details that normally filled the space between us, and I answered in the same controlled manner I had been using for days. But internally, I was tracking every phrase against the timeline I had reconstructed. After dinner, she mentioned that the upcoming week would be heavier with meetings and possibly travel again. And as she spoke, I realized that the next window of financial movement would likely align with her absence, just as the previous ones had. That night after she went to bed, I accessed the compiled authorization structure again and focused not on the transactions themselves, but on the sequence of approvals leading into them. And I noticed something I had not fully appreciated before. Every major transfer required a short chain of confirmations that always included a secondary authorization from the consulting entity tied to Daniel Cooper, which meant his role was not incidental, but structurally necessary to the movement of funds. And that realization changed the nature of the entire situation because it was no longer about hidden activity within a marriage. It was about a dependent system where one external actor functioned as a consistent validation point inside our financial structure. The next morning, I met Michael Harris in person at a small office downtown, and he brought printed diagrams of the authorization flow, showing how the system could be traced as a network rather than isolated events. He pointed out how each transfer created a loop that returned legitimacy back into the account structure, allowing future transactions to inherit trust from previous ones. And as he explained it, I understood why it had been so difficult to detect from the outside, because nothing was broken in isolation. Everything was functioning exactly as designed, just not for the purpose I had assumed. He looked at me and said quietly that if I intended to challenge this, I would need to shift from interpretation to documentation at a formal level, because informal observation would never outweigh structured authorization history in a dispute environment. I left the office with copies of everything he had prepared and drove for a long time without turning on the radio, letting the weight of the information settle without distraction, because I knew now that the next stage was no longer about understanding what had happened. It was about deciding when to reveal that I understood it fully. And as I parked in front of our house that evening and saw Olivia's car already in the driveway, I realized that whatever equilibrium had existed between us was no longer real. It was only waiting for the moment someone finally proved it had already been broken. The moment I parked in front of the house that evening, I already knew something in the structure of my life had reached its final alignment, not because anything visible had changed on the surface, but because everything I now understood about the financial system, the authorization network, and Daniel Cooper's role inside it had reached a point where silence was no longer neutral. It was active participation, and as I sat in the car for a few seconds before stepping out, I realized that the next time I spoke about any of this, it would no longer be speculation, it would be disclosure. Olivia was already inside when I entered the house, her bag placed neatly by the stairs, her shoes aligned with the same precision she always maintained in small domestic details that used to feel comforting but now felt procedural. She greeted me normally, asking if I wanted dinner, mentioning she had a long call earlier with clients on the East Coast, and I listened carefully not for emotion but for structure, because emotion could be performed, but structure revealed dependency. I responded calmly, saying I had already eaten, and for a moment we moved through the same space like two systems running in parallel without interaction. Later that night after she went upstairs, I sat alone at the dining table with the documents Michael Harris had prepared, printed flow diagrams, transaction chains, authorization loops, and I studied them again not for new information, but for confirmation that what I had already concluded was stable under repeated examination. Every pathway still led back to the same controlled mechanism. where legitimate access had been layered into a sequence that allowed funds to move without triggering conventional alerts. And at the center of that structure remained the consulting authorization tied to Daniel Cooper, acting as both endpoint and validation node, which meant his involvement was not peripheral but essential to the entire financial movement system. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair, letting the realization settle fully for the first time without resistance. Because what I had been resisting was not the evidence, but the implication of intent behind it. The next morning I left the house earlier than usual and drove to meet Michael Harris again, this time bringing everything I had compiled on my own timeline, every transaction, every travel record, every authorization change mapped in chronological order. And when he reviewed it, his expression shifted slightly in a way that confirmed he saw the same pattern I had begun to see days earlier. He explained that when systems are used exactly as designed, but with coordinated intent, the result is often invisible until someone reconstructs the entire sequence backward. Because individual actions remain valid while the outcome becomes misleading only in aggregate, he told me that if this were to be formally challenged, the strength would not come from any single transfer or document, but from demonstrating continuity of pattern over time. I asked him what that would require, and he said everything: complete logs, full account histories, verified authorization timestamps, and a clear demonstration that access and movement were synchronized beyond reasonable coincidence. I left his office with a physical copy of his analysis and drove without a destination for nearly an hour, because what I now understood was not just the mechanics of what had happened, but the scale of preparation it would take to execute something like this without immediate detection. And by the time I returned home, Olivia's car was already in the driveway again. As if the day had never left its expected course, she was in the kitchen when I entered, preparing tea, and she asked me casually about my afternoon. And I answered in the same controlled tone I had learned to maintain, but internally I no longer saw our home as a shared space. I saw it as the final environment where two competing interpretations of the same reality still coexisted without collision, and I understood that this equilibrium could not continue indefinitely, because once a system is fully mapped, it eventually demands resolution, not through emotion, but through exposure of structure. And as I stood there watching Olivia move through the kitchen with calm precision, I knew that the next step would determine which version of this life would remain standing after the truth was finally made visible. That morning felt different in a way I could no longer ignore, not because anything in the house had changed, but because I had already reached the point where waiting for change no longer made sense. And I woke up before sunrise with a strange sense of final clarity, as if my mind had already accepted a decision my body had not yet carried out. I sat at the dining table for the last time in the same position I had been using for weeks, reviewing everything I had built, every transaction, every authorization chain, every time-stamped pattern that linked Olivia's movements with Daniel Cooper's financial involvement. And for the first time, I did not feel uncertainty. I only felt sequence, cause and effect arranged in a structure that no longer required interpretation. Olivia came downstairs at 6:45 as usual, fully composed, wearing a light gray blazer and carrying her travel bag. She paused briefly when she saw me sitting at the table and asked if I was up early for work, and I nodded without elaboration, watching her closely but not searching for anything anymore, because I was no longer in the phase of discovery. I was in the phase of confirmation. She made coffee, checked her phone, and mentioned a meeting that would take her out of town for 2 days, and I listened carefully knowing this would likely be the final movement in the pattern I had been tracking. After she left the house, I waited exactly 20 minutes before leaving myself, driving not to work, but directly to Michael Harris's office downtown, carrying every document, every printed log, every reconstructed timeline that had taken me weeks to assemble. When I arrived, he was already prepared, as if he had anticipated the direction this would take. And without unnecessary conversation, I placed everything on the table. He reviewed it in silence for a long time, flipping through pages, cross-referencing sequences, and mapping the structure against the authorization model he had previously explained. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of final confirmation. He said the system was consistent with coordinated multi-layer authorization misuse, where legitimate access was used to construct a parallel financial pathway that could only exist if all involved permissions remained active and unchallenged over time. I asked him directly what that meant in practical terms, and he said it meant the movement of funds was not accidental, not isolated, and not reversible through simple correction. It was a structured pattern that required formal disclosure to be addressed. I sat there for a moment without responding, not because I was surprised, but because I had already arrived at the conclusion he was now confirming. And what I needed now was not understanding but execution. He asked me if I was ready to proceed with formal escalation, and I told him yes without hesitation, because hesitation no longer had a place in the system I was dealing with. I left his office and drove back home one final time, arriving in the late afternoon as the sun began to lower across the neighborhood. Olivia was already there, her car in the driveway, her presence inside the house familiar yet distant in a way that now felt irreversible. I entered quietly and placed the folder on the dining table, not dramatically, not abruptly, just with intention. She looked at it, then at me, and for the first time I saw a break in her composure, not panic, not anger, but recognition, the kind that arrives when a system you believed was hidden is suddenly no longer hidden at all. I told her calmly that I had reviewed every transaction, every authorization layer, and every financial pathway connected to our accounts, and that I had verified the involvement structure involving Daniel Cooper and the consulting entity tied to him. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply presented the structure as it was, and the silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. She sat down slowly, looking at the documents without speaking, and I realized in that moment that the conversation was no longer about explanation. It was about consequence. I informed her that everything had already been documented and submitted for formal review through financial compliance channels, and that moving forward there would be no informal resolution between us because the system itself had already been escalated beyond personal control. She did not respond immediately, and when she finally did, her voice was low and controlled, asking when I had started to suspect, and I told her that suspicion was never the starting point, only the delay between pattern recognition and confirmation. The room remained still after that, not tense, but finished, like a process that had reached its final stage. And as I stood there looking at everything we had built over 8 years, I understood that the version of our life that had existed in parallel structures was no longer sustainable, not because of emotion, but because every system eventually resolves into its true shape when fully exposed. And that night, as I left the house for the last time under the same quiet streets that had once defined our routine, I realized that the truth had not destroyed anything. It had simply revealed what had already been operating beneath it all along.